Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Meaghan Callahan. I'm a senior policy researcher with the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. This is the third in a series of presentations that we've been offering on the state budget process, focused on the investments that we've seen included for municipalities, K through 12 education, and higher education. We've been really pleased to be able to offer these presentations throughout the budget process and hope to be able to continue to do so. But we want to make sure that we're also answering the questions that you have that are most pressing and including the most relevant information. So we're hoping to follow up with folks after the fact with a brief survey to get any feedback that you might have for us. But outside of that, please always feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about our research or just looking to engage with us further. And for those of you who might be new to the presentations or new to MTF, Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy organization focused on state and local fiscal, tax, and economic policies. And it's our mission to provide accurate, unbiased research with thoughtful recommendations that strengthen the state's finances, but also foster the long-term well-being of the state and economic opportunity for all. In terms of what I'm planning to cover in this morning's presentation, I'm going to start off with an update on fiscal year 2023 and then talk big picture about the fiscal year 2024 budget process. Then I'm going to spend some time up front reviewing income surtax structure and spending and the differences that we've seen proposed by both the House and the Senate for how we collect, track, and spend these new revenues. And then I'll detail the specific investments included in the Senate budget for municipalities, K through 12 education, and higher education before ending with a look ahead to the conference committee process. So starting with the fiscal year 2023 update, we have a list of 5 things that we think are really helpful to know heading into the final month of the fiscal year. So number 1, tax revenue collections in fiscal year 2023 did rebound slightly in May after falling $1.2 billion below benchmark in April, which was a pretty dramatic fall off. I'm sure many of you heard about it. And this was a big departure from the revenue trends that we had seen through March in fiscal year 2023, when revenues had actually been running hundreds of millions of dollars ahead of benchmark. We did regain some ground in May, in large part because monthly revenue collections performed better than expectations, coming in $169 million above the updated monthly benchmark. So through May, revenues currently stand about $1 billion below where we expected them to be at this point in the fiscal year. It is important to note, though, that this dramatic decline in revenues was largely anticipated and can be attributed to 2 factors that I think both budget writers but also economic experts predicted, and that's declines in capital gains tax collections as well as other non-withholding income. These trends will make closing out fiscal year 2023 more challenging, but it's likely that they're not going to require any late in the year budget cuts. And we think that fiscal year 2024 budget assumptions still remain reasonable. And then the last couple of things I'll mention are just that there continues to be about $1.7 billion in one-time state surplus funds set aside in the transitional escrow fund, and also a small portion of federal ARPA funds still remaining. And then the tax relief proposals that we've seen put forward by the governor, the House, and now the Senate are all impacting fiscal years 2024 and beyond, and not fiscal year 2023. And so to offer a visual just on fiscal year 2023 revenue collections to date, this chart is looking at 2 things. So the blue bars are looking at fiscal year 2023 revenue benchmarks compared to actual fiscal year 2022 revenue collections. And then the yellow bars are looking at actual fiscal year 2023 collections, again, compared to fiscal year 2022. So what the blue bars here are showing us are that budget writers anticipated fiscal year 23 revenues to fall pretty far below where things stood in fiscal year 2022. And then what the yellow bars are showing us are that through March, actual collections were outpacing those expectations, and in some cases actually outpacing fiscal year 2022 collections as well. And then that obviously changes when we get to April, in which we see actual collections fall below benchmark for the first time. That continues in May, but now the gap between this blue bar and the yellow bar for the month of May does decrease slightly, and that's related to those improved revenue collections within the month of May specifically. And so to talk a little bit in more detail about those two factors impacting revenues that I mentioned earlier, both capital gains tax collections and other non-withheld income, specifically tax credits related to what's known as the pass-through entity excise. This table is looking at what budget writers anticipated non-withholding income revenue trends to look like in fiscal year 2023 and what we've actually seen so far to date. So budget writers anticipated that non-withholding income would fall by 26.1% in fiscal year 2023 compared to 2022. And through March, we saw non-withholding income actually fall by 42.2%. So 42.2%, obviously a little bit bigger than 26.1%. But I think what is really helpful when comparing these two numbers is taking a little bit of a wider view of the revenue trends. So when MTF testified at the consensus revenue hearing back in January, Doug and Andy on our team had projected that capital gains tax collections and some other non-withheld income tax collections would fall by 46.9% and 37.2% respectively over the course of fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2024. And the 42.2% drop that we've seen in non-withholding income does fall within that range. And so I think the takeaway here is that while the drop in revenue that we've seen through May has been steep, it was largely anticipated, but the outstanding question was never really one of if these revenues would fall, but rather when over the course of these two fiscal years we would see that drop. It's also really helpful, I think, when looking at these revenue trends to keep in mind the historical context. So this is a chart that we've been updating since the beginning of the year to compare fiscal year 23 revenue collections to pre-pandemic revenue trends. And prior to the pandemic, revenues had been growing at an average annual growth rate of 5.1%. And that's illustrated in this graph by the yellow line. And apart from fiscal year 2020, when I think the state felt kind of the brunt of the pandemic's revenue impacts, actual collections have been performing better than that pre-pandemic trend of 5.1%. And even when we look at fiscal year 2023, if we end the fiscal year at about $1 billion below the updated benchmark, which is where we stand right now, we're still anticipating to end at $2.5 billion ahead of what that pre-pandemic growth trend would have suggested. And then I think the last thing that I'll mention related to monitoring these FY23 revenue trends are just the funds that the state continues to have available in reserve. So like I mentioned earlier, a total of $1.7 billion in combined state surplus revenue still being held in that transitional escrow fund, and then $300 million in federal ARPA dollars are still available. So all in total, $1.7 billion exists in available resources. And this is in addition to some other trust funds and of course the stabilization fund that I think the legislature have been really cognizant about building up in recent years. So the state stabilization fund currently has a balance of over $7 billion. And then in the last 2 years, the legislature has created these two new funds specifically related to education, the Student Opportunity Act Implementation Fund, and then we have another Early Education and Care Trust Fund as well. So all in the Stabilization Fund, this SOA Fund, EEC Fund, and the Transitional Escrow Fund, I think leave budget writers with kind of a plethora of options available to them if that's needed to close the books on fiscal year 2023. But all these factors combined, I think, give us a reasonable amount of confidence that we'll be able to close fiscal year 2023 without any late in the year budget cuts, and the fiscal year 24 budget process can kind of continue on as planned. And so now just to turn to that process and where things currently stand, we're currently in the process of conference committee negotiations, and representatives from both sides have been appointed. So on the House side, they're being represented by Chairman Michaelitz, Representative Ferrante, and Representative Smola. And then on the Senate side, by Chairman Rodrigues, Senator Friedman, and Senator O'Connor. And just to review where we've been so far, we obviously saw the governor release her inaugural budget on March 1st. The House finalized their budget proposal on April 26th, and then the Senate passed its final budget on May 25th. The fiscal year starts on July 1st. And just given kind of the task ahead of Conference Committee negotiators to reconcile all spending and policy differences between both the House and the Senate budgets, it does seem pretty unlikely that we'll see a final budget produced, I think, before that July 1st deadline. And so now to talk specifically about those investments that we've seen in the Senate budget. And I'm going to start off with another kind of top 5 list. But number 1, the Senate budget does not reflect a specific tax relief proposal, instead choosing to set aside $575 million to cover the fiscal year 2024 costs of a future tax bill. We saw that tax bill released by Senate Ways and Means last Thursday. They're actually set to debate amendments to that tomorrow during formal session. Number 2, the Senate budget uses income surtax revenue to fund a series of unique priorities kind of separate from the House, including things like additional assistance for school building projects, regional transit authorities, and cost-free community college. We also see the Senate budget include a structure to collect, track, and spend income surtax revenues that for the most part follows the framework passed by the House pretty closely. Number 4 is going to be really important to keep in mind when we start assessing overall spending differences between the House and the Senate budget. The Senate is relying on $437 million in trust fund resources to support spending specifically in the areas of early education and care and behavioral health. And then lastly, the Senate budget includes 91 outside policy sections. So the Senate Ways and Means Committee budget was released on May 9th, and then senators debated that budget in the 4 days in the week prior to Memorial Day weekend. And over the course of those 4 days of debate, they added $82.2 million in new spending and 34 outside policy sections. The vast majority of that new spending came in the form of earmarks, and $10.3 million supported more statewide or programmatic initiatives, non-earmark spending. In terms of the areas where we saw the greatest amount of new investment, number 1 was health and human services. We saw an additional $24.1 million added on the floor, followed by economic development and then education at $13.1 million in new funding. So in total, the Senate budget includes $55.9 billion in line item spending. That's $3.5 billion more than the FY23 budget that was signed into law by Governor Baker last year, and it's $669 million more than the governor's proposal. $500 million more than the House budget. And again, this is where it's important to keep in mind those trust fund resources, because of that nearly $500 million difference, $437 million of it can be attributed to those trust funds related to early education and care, as well as behavioral health. And then this graph looks at those spending differences between the House and Senate budgets across major categories. So the largest differences being in healthcare and then education. On healthcare, $192 million of that $223 million increase in the Senate budget versus the House budget is related to those trust fund resources. And then similarly on early education, the Senate draws down $245 million in trust fund resources to support a child care stabilization grant program. On higher education and K-12 education, the big spending differences between the House and the Senate budget are really attributable to the different ways in which they're choosing to deploy income surtax resources. And I'm going to kind of detail the specific programs that they're each prioritizing in a few slides later on in the presentation. So in terms of structure, both the House and the Senate propose a very similar framework consisting of 3 trust funds. So we have the Education and Transportation Trust Fund, the Education and Transportation Reserve Fund, and then the Education and Transportation Capital Fund. And in both budgets, spending in fiscal year 2024 is limited by a $1 billion spending cap. This spending cap had been agreed to as part of the fiscal year 24 consensus revenue process, and it was reflected in the governor's budget proposal as well. Also in both budgets, revenue collections above that $1 billion spending cap are diverted to two trust funds. So 15% of collections above that cap go to the Education and Transportation Reserve Fund, and then 85% of collections above the spending cap are diverted to the Innovation and Capital Fund. Revenues sent to the Reserve Fund are really intended to support ongoing spending if revenue collections fall pretty dramatically below expectations, and the balance of that reserve cannot exceed 33% of the spending cap. And then revenues in the Innovation and Capital Fund are really only intended to be used for one-time costs and capital projects, things like PAYGO capital, but the Senate is much more explicit in those uses compared to the House budget, and that's one of the main differences in the proposals that they've both put forward. The other difference is just how the annual spending cap will be set in future years. So under the House budget, the spending cap will continue to be set as part of the annual consensus revenue process. And then in the Senate budget for fiscal years 24 through 26, it'll be set as part of consensus revenue. And then going forward, it'll be based on a 10-year average of income surtax collections. In terms of surtax spending overall, the House and the Senate budget both evenly split resources between education and transportation, but then we see differences emerge within those two buckets. So the House budget dedicates more resources towards K through 12 education as well as the MBTA, whereas the Senate budget is really focusing on higher education investments and regional transit authorities. And so to dive into those differences in both K through 12 as well as higher education, K through 12 is really where we see the biggest divergence in surtax spending between the two budgets. Each budget has no shared spending priorities between them. So the House budget focuses on the continuation of the Universal School Meals Program funded at $161 million. And they also create a new Green School Works project funded at $100 million. This will provide some additional grant funding to school districts to help purchase and install energy efficient infrastructure, things like solar panels and new HVAC systems. The Senate instead chooses to fund an expansion of early college and innovation pathways programs at $10 million. This was originally proposed in the governor's budget. And then they also create a new public school infrastructure program funded at $100 million. But this would be under the MSBA, and it would direct some additional aid to school districts that are facing school building project cost overruns that I think are really a result of some of the challenges that we faced during the pandemic. So the pandemic, when we saw really increasing inflation as well as materials costs for construction projects, were leading the overall cost of school building projects to really outrun original estimates. And so according to the Senate, this grant program would be available to 30 school districts that are kind of facing this known issue and that are already engaged in the MSBA and in the capital project pipeline. When it comes to surtax spending for higher education, we do see some more shared priorities between the two budgets, totaling $104 million. So both branches include funding for things like financial aid expansion, as well as the Mass Reconnect program. But then the Senate dedicates more higher ed investment towards higher education capital projects, student support services, as well as the implementation of free community college. And when we get to the higher ed section of the presentation, I'm going to speak in more detail about those cost-free community college proposals. And then the House, in contrast, prioritizes an investment in the Endowment Incentive Program for community colleges, state universities, and the University of Massachusetts, and creates this new high demand scholarship program, which has some unique elements. It's funded at $50 million in the House budget, and it includes a requirement that recipients of the scholarship would need to commit to staying in Massachusetts and working in Massachusetts for 5 years post-graduation. So looking ahead to conference and how budget negotiators might go about reconciling some of these differences in how they're spending surtax resources. Across all spending, the House and the Senate budgets share $449 million in surtax spending priorities, with each branch including $551 million in unique spending. To include all of the shared spending as well as the unique spending proposed in each budget, would cost $1.5 billion. But given that $1 billion spending cap that we have for fiscal year 2024, that's obviously not possible. And so that means that about $500 million in surtax spending will need to be reduced or cut. But that is a little bit easier when it comes to surtax spending as opposed to other conference committee negotiations, just because some of the programs that are being supported by surtax revenues are newer. And so when we're cutting funding or potentially reducing funding for new programs, it doesn't limit the amount of resources that certain schools or projects or programs have already come to rely on, but it might be reducing the reach of some of these new programs. So now I'm going to turn to the specific investments included in the Senate budget for municipal finance, K through 12, and higher education, and starting off with unrestricted general government aid, or UGA. So the Senate budget increases funding for local aid to cities and towns by about $20 million over the House budget. The House had increased UGA funding by 1.6% over fiscal year 2023. And the Senate doubles that increase to 3.2%. So sending about $20 million more to cities and towns. Payment in lieu of taxes, or the pilot program, is level funded between both the governor as well as the House budgets. When we think about the different funding levels included for UGA in both the House and the Senate budget, it obviously raises some questions for how that could be reconciled during the conference committee process. And just to look back at what happened in fiscal year 2023, we did also see the Senate go above and beyond the House to increase funding for local cities and towns by $63 million over the prior fiscal year. And they did that using the same methodology that was used in fiscal year 24. They doubled the consensus revenue growth percentage. So we can't say for certain how this will shake out in fiscal year 2024, but it's likely that the increase for local aid and UGA will fall within that range of $19.7 million over fiscal year 23 as proposed by the House, or $39.4 million as proposed by the Senate. The Senate budget also creates the Unrestricted General Government Aid Distribution Review Commission through a new outside policy section. And this is a commission that's directed to study the distribution methodology used to allocate local funds to municipalities and review really all aspects of general local aid, including any equity discrepancies, the extent to which cities and towns' needs are reflected by the current formula, as well as any alternative distribution methodologies for local aid. The commission consists of 11 members and is directed to file their recommendations with the legislature by July 1st, 2024. A couple other municipal programs that I thought were worth highlighting. The Senate funds regional aid funds local aid to regional libraries and public libraries at about $2 million more than the House budget. And then the Senate funds the municipalities' regionalization and efficiencies reserve at about $5 million less than the House. And within that reserve, there are some differences in earmarked funds for specific programs. Both budgets include $3 million for the District Local Technical Assistance Fund, but then the Senate includes, at least explicitly, $5 million for a new competitive grant program under the Executive Office of Public Service and $2 million for regional planning agencies. And then one of the last things I'll just mention on municipal finance specifically is related to a new outside section that the Senate adopted during debate, which would transfer $30 million from the FY23 consolidated net surplus to the Community Preservation Trust Fund. So turning now to K through 12 education and starting off with Chapter 70 aid, we see the Senate, like the governor and the House before them, fully fund the third year of implementation for the Student Opportunity Act, which is a $594 million increase over fiscal year 2023. The Senate budget, like the House budget, reflects updated foundation budget enrollment projections. And then the Senate also increases minimum per pupil aid to $60 as opposed to $30 that was proposed in the governor's budget. One difference here is just that the Senate does include that increase to minimum aid fully within the main Chapter 70 line item, whereas the House includes it in a separate supplemental line item. This is a chart that I'm sure is very familiar to many of you who have joined us before, but it's just looking at year-over-year increases in Chapter 78. But I still think it is pretty remarkable to look at prior to SOA implementation up to fiscal year 2022, we were really looking at local aid increases of between $100 and $200 million. Whereas in the last few years, we've now seen these increases soar to between 500 and 600 million. And then another comparison that is familiar to many of you, but that I did want to highlight now that we've seen the final Chapter 78 proposals from both the House and the Senate, are just a comparison of the different components of the Student Opportunity Act implementation. So for foundation budget rates, both the House and the Senate have now agreed to increase them by a 3/6 increment towards the full Student Opportunity Act goal rate. Both budgets count low-income students up to 185% of the federal poverty level threshold. And then for minimum aid, obviously both included at $60 per pupil. So in terms of conference committee negotiations, I think it's pretty safe to say that Chapter 78 will remain as it's been in both the House and the Senate budgets. And then one thing we've talked a lot about before when it comes to implementation of the Student Opportunity Act is just that it's directing huge amounts of new state aid to a ton of districts across the state, but it's also resulting in increased required local contributions for many districts as well. And this is particularly true for middle income and some higher income communities. And I think in recognition of these challenges, we've seen two proposals put forward by both the governor and now the legislature. So in her budget, Governor Healy proposed a $10 million reserve account to provide some additional relief to those districts disproportionately facing increased required local contributions, whereas the House and the Senate have agreed to increase that minimum aid per pupil amount up to $60. And increasing minimum aid per pupil does have a benefit of targeting a similar group of middle and higher income districts, but it does so through an already known methodology that's based on student enrollment. And when we look at how that increase in minimum aid is being targeted towards different types of districts, we do see it targeting the same ones that are facing increased required local contributions. So that's what this last slide on Chapter 70 is taking a look at, is how that increase to $60 per pupil in minimum aid is being distributed across different types of low-income districts. So 67% of Chapter 78 increase associated with increasing minimum aid is going to districts and low-income groups 2 through 8. Group 11 is obviously an outlier here, but that's entirely related to the city of Boston. So within the foundation budget formula, Boston is really a unique entity. They educate a large share of low-income and higher need students, but then they also have a strong local revenue base. And so within the formula, they're considered a minimum aid community. And that's why you see them reflected on this chart as receiving a pretty decent share of that minimum aid increase. Turning now to some education reimbursement accounts, and starting off with the circuit breaker program, the Senate budget funds circuit breaker at $504 million, which is level with the governor's budget, but $2.3 million less than the House. Some key takeaways for conference here, I think, are that the House and the Senate both appear to fully meet the reimbursement requirements for both instructional costs as well as out-of-district transportation in fiscal year 2024. And both budgets include Governor Healy's proposal to fund extraordinary relief payments at $20 million. This is the component of the circuit breaker program that will help direct some additional aid to those districts facing increases in their out-of-district special education costs related to the 14% OSD rate increase. And then the House also increased this funding. This is contributing to that $2.3 million difference with the Senate for one programmatic earmark within the line item. It's a DDS residential placement prevention program. And then the last thing I'll mention on circuit breaker is just that we saw a proposal from Governor Healy to offer an additional $75 million for extraordinary relief payments for districts dealing with this 14% OSD rate increase. And she included that in the supplemental budget. That funding has not yet been taken up by either the House or the Senate. But during Senate debate, I think there was a recognition from a number of senators who spoke on the floor about this funding, and it could be considered in future vehicles. In terms of charter tuition reimbursement, the Senate budget funds that at $230.3 million, which is $2.4 million less than the House, and about $10 million less than what we saw in the governor's budget. That big difference between the Senate and the House budgets and what the governor proposed is really just related to some updated projections from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education about charter tuition costs. And so it's not reflecting a lack of meeting the required reimbursement requirement. And in fact, both the House and the Senate budget do appear to meet that statutorily required 100% reimbursement rate. The difference for charter tuition reimbursement between the House and the Senate budgets is being driven by differences in the per pupil facilities aid rate. So the per pupil facilities aid rate is a component of the charter tuition reimbursement formula that sends some additional aid to charter schools for building and facility maintenance costs, but it's fully reimbursed to districts through the formula. So the House increases that rate by $100, and then the Senate increases that rate by $50 per pupil. So again, this is sending some additional aid to charter schools, but it is being fully reimbursed then by the state through the formula. I'll talk about student transportation quickly. But there are some unique priorities between the two branches here. We see the House focused on regional school transportation, providing 100% reimbursement, but then excluding funding entirely for non-resident vocational student transportation. There's only similarity between the House and Senate budgets when it comes to transportation reimbursement is on homeless student transportation. Both budgets fully fund that reimbursement at $28.7 million. And then my last couple slides on K through 12 education just highlight those unique and new investment and policy proposals related to school building infrastructure. And I touched on both the Green School Works program as well as the MSBA Capital Supports program proposed by the House and the Senate earlier. So I also want to talk about some of the proposals that we've seen from the House and the Senate related to the MSBA grant cap. So the grant cap is the amount that the Mass School Building Authority is authorized each year to help pay for school building projects. The House increases that grant cap by about $300 million up to $1.1 billion. And the Senate goes a little bit further, including a $400 million increase up to $1.2 billion. A couple other unique elements included in the Senate budget. They did adopt an amendment during Senate debate, which would exclude accelerated repair program grants from that statutory cap, making the entirety of the $1.2 billion available to the main capital project pipeline program. They also include a new MSBA commission to make recommendations on both the current and future needs of MSBA projects. I included a ESSER funding update in here as well. I won't spend time on it because I want to make sure we can get to higher education funding. But the main takeaway here is that districts have about $1.5 billion in ESSER funding remaining. And as far as we can tell, this ESSER funding sent to districts is not subject to some of the COVID clawback components of the debt ceiling negotiations that I'm sure many people were paying attention to a couple of weeks ago. But now to spend some time talking about higher education in both the House and the Senate budgets. And I think when we exclude surtax spending, which we reviewed earlier, a big story here is that there aren't too many substantial differences between community colleges, state universities, and funding for the University of Massachusetts. When we look at community college campuses and state university campuses, these minor differences that we see between the House and the Senate budgets are really due to earmarks and then some independent increases for specific campus programs or centers. When it comes to UMass, the House budget did include some funding increases for specific UMass centers. And then they also included a $4.8 million increase for the main campus account. As far as we can tell, that increase wasn't tied to a specific earmark or initiative. It's just kind of an overall funding increase for the campus system. A very similar story on scholarship programs when we exclude the surtax investments that the House and Senate make. Really funding between for scholarship programs between the two budgets is basically level funded. So the Community College Success Program foster care and adopted fee waivers, and then foster care financial aid are all level between the two budgets. The Senate does exclude funding for this high demand scholarship program, which was included at $2 million in the House budget. This is a different high demand scholarship program than what the House is supporting with $50 million in surtax revenue. And then the Senate includes a slight increase for the state's main scholarship program. This main scholarship reserve is where funding for some of the major scholarship programs in the state comes from, things like Mass Grant and Mass Grant Plus, the Gilbert Grant Scholarship Program, and then early educator scholarships and a few other smaller programs. But of particular note in the Senate budget for higher education is the emphasis on laying the groundwork for a cost-free community college system. And that starts with the funding that both branches included for the governor's Mass Reconnect program, each funded at $20 million. And so that's kind of guaranteed inclusion in the final conference report. But the Senate does go further to create two other programs to help create a cost-free community college system. We have this free community college for nursing students funded at $20 million, which I think in some ways is similar to Mass Reconnect because it's expanding a cost-free community college track for a specific population group of students. And then they also include $15 million for this free community college implementation supports account, which directs additional funding to both the department and the Massachusetts Association of Community Colleges to help lay the groundwork, build the infrastructure, and build the capacity that's necessary to support implementation of a free community college system by the fall of 2024, so by next fall. And then another unique proposal included in the Senate budget is this expansion of in-state tuition rates and financial aid eligibility to undocumented students who attend at least 3 years of high school in Massachusetts. MTF actually has a pretty long history of researching and reporting on this policy issue beginning back in 2006. And in the coming weeks, we are hoping to publish an update on that analysis that finds that in this policy's first year of implementation, it could generate between $2.6 and $3.5 million in new revenue for public colleges and universities in its first year of implementation, kind of the most new revenue being directed towards community colleges potentially, because that's where we assume most of these students, if they choose to attend public school in Massachusetts, may choose to enroll in post-secondary school as well. Now, I'll caveat these numbers by just saying a few things. First of all, there's a certain group of students in Massachusetts, notably DACA eligible students that are actually already eligible for in-state tuition rates. And so these numbers can definitely move around. But I think in our point of view, MTF kind of sees this policy proposal as a potentially common sense way to really expand higher ed affordability, but also stem some of the workforce and demographic challenges that the state is facing as a whole, but I think our public higher ed campuses are facing pretty specifically when it comes to declining enrollment numbers. My last slide on higher ed before looking ahead to the conference committee process just takes a look at the different investments that we've also seen for college and career readiness programs, and specifically early college and dual enrollment. So the Senate budget includes a total of $38 million for early college programs, including $15 million for the early college program under the Executive Office of Education, $13 million for the dual enrollment program under the Department of Higher Education, and then $10 million in those surtax investments that I spoke about earlier. And this represents kind of the high watermark in fiscal year 2024 for funding for early college and dual enrollment. And I've said this in earlier presentations, so I don't mean to repeat myself, but I think the funding increases that we've seen for these programs, particularly in the last 2 years, really speaks to the early success that they've seen in terms of encouraging more students to pursue post-secondary school, to remain enrolled in school, and to find success there. So now to kind of look ahead at the conference committee process and what all of this spending, both shared and unique, means for budget writers who are tasked with producing the final conference report. So the first step in conference negotiations is to determine all the spending that's been proposed by the House and the Senate budgets and compare that to available resources. And doing that is going to help us find any potential funding gap that exists between proposed spending and available revenues, and what, if to any extent, funding may need to be reduced or cut or potentially covered with other resources. So the House budget, excluding surtax revenue, because we think that will be kind of settled outside of the traditional conference negotiation process, includes $54.6 billion in spending. And the Senate budget includes $54.9 billion. The vast majority of spending between the two budgets is shared, $54.1 billion, meaning that the House has about $600 million in unique spending available to it, and then the Senate includes just under $900 million in unique spending. And so to include all of the spending in common as well as the unique spending would cost, we estimate, about $55.5 billion in the final budget. And again, this is excluding surtax spending. But then when we look at the available revenues to support spending in fiscal year 2024, we estimate there to be only $55 billion. This is predominantly made up of the $40 billion consensus tax revenue estimate, and then not shared non-tax revenues as well, so things like federal reimbursements and departmental revenues. This figure also includes some independent revenue maximization initiatives included in either budget, and then it reflects those trust fund resources tapped by the Senate, because those resources, of course, remain available during conference as well. So all in, comparing $55.5 billion in maximum spending and $55 billion in maximum revenues, we end up with this potential difference of just over $500 million. That's the amount by which we estimate spending will need to be reduced or cut, or like I said, covered with other resources in order to fit within available revenues. But it is important to note that this gap can be closed in a number of different ways, some of which don't involve spending reductions or cuts. For example, this revenue figure does not include the $200 million estimate that the House targets for the legalization of online lottery. And if the Senate were to accept that proposal, that could reduce this difference down closer to $300 million. And then additionally, like we reviewed earlier, the state continues to have access to some of those resources set aside in reserves. And though there could be different reasons for why you should or shouldn't use those to complete the fiscal year 2024 budget, they do still remain available. This table just compares that unique spending in both the House and the Senate budgets across major categories. The only thing I'll note here is just the amount of unique spending that's comprised of earmarks, over $430 million, followed by healthcare, education, and housing. And on that education sector, again, the biggest differences are really in the early education and care sector. Across higher ed and K through 12 education, there are smaller unique spending items for things like the METCO program, student wellness supports, targeted intervention, and some food insecurity initiatives as well. And then the last thing I'll note regarding conference negotiations is just the increase in recent years that we've seen in the number of earmarks added to both the House and the Senate budgets. So for both the House and the Senate, fiscal year 2024 represented kind of the high watermark for earmarks added during House and Senate debate. And as we saw in the previous table, they make up a pretty large portion, the largest portion of unique spending across the two budgets. And earmarks obviously play a really important role in the budget process, helping to target specific funding to communities and projects and really important programs. But it is worth noting just that as the amount of earmarks within the budget increase, it does crowd out resources that are available to support other programs, and maybe even programs that distribute funding for similar purposes, but through more transparent ways, like grant programs that maybe have a competitive application process. So just to wrap up where we started, the fiscal year 2024 budget process and the conference report is due by July 1st. Budget writers definitely have their work cut out for them in terms of reconciling all of these different spending and policy differences that we just reviewed. And revenue trends might make that process a little bit more challenging this year. But once the conference report is enacted, Governor Healy will have 10 days to offer amendments or send back vetoes to the budget. And then the House and the Senate will be able to override those vetoes with a 2/3 majority vote in both branches. So thank you all both for your patience with my internet connectivity issues and for listening to all of this information. I know that that was a lot to review, but I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
There was one in the chat, Megan. Elizabeth Becker asked if there is a use it or lose it date for the ARPA and surplus revenues.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of state surplus revenues in the transitional escrow fund, there's no hard deadline that we see with other federal resources. That funding can continue to remain in that fund, and there's no pressure for budget writers to draw it down by any specific date. For the federal ARPA funds, there is a deadline by which they need to be obligated and spent. That's by 2026. I think the administration has been really intentional in getting that funding out the door as quickly as possible to avoid any potential issues. I think like the scare that maybe we saw or some people felt during debt ceiling negotiations. And then on the federal ESSER funding that districts have still at their disposal, over $1.5 billion, that funding does need to be obligated by September of 2024.
Perfect, thanks. And then I got a couple others kind of in private chat. What are some of the tools that budget negotiators could tap to help kind of close the gap between total spending and what's actually available for the budget?
Sure. Yeah, so hopefully some of my last slides help to answer this question. But when we're looking at that approximately $500 million gap between total spending and available resources, spending reductions and cuts can be used to close that gap. But then there are also other revenue proposals like the House's legalization of online lottery that could provide potentially up to $200 million in revenue if that's the estimate that's agreed to between the two branches. And then those resources that we just discussed in transitional escrow, as well as some other reserve funds that are available as well.
Great. And then I know you talked a little bit about earmarks, but there was a question about kind of the impact increased earmark spending has on being able to reconcile spending differences between the two budgets.
Yeah, another good question. So earmark spending obviously makes up the majority of the unique spending in both the House and the Senate budgets. And so if those earmarks are prioritized during the conference process to include them all in the final budget, that does limit some of the resources that are available to support unique spending initiatives in other areas of the budget. So that's just, I think, something to keep in mind as we continue to watch this kind of increase in adopted earmarks in recent years. They serve a really important purpose and they direct funds in a really intentional way. But it does reduce the amount of funding that's available for other, maybe equally as important priorities.
Great, thanks. And then last one here about how conference committee process will impact local aid for cities and towns.
Yeah, so there was a State House News article yesterday, maybe some of you saw it, just about how local aid, given the different funding levels proposed by both the House and the Senate budgets, are kind of in limbo as they wait to see what's included in that final conference report. And that is a challenge when local aid is subject to the annual budget process. But like I said earlier, I think if we look to prior years for some guidance as to what could happen in future years, it's likely that the final local aid increase will fall in between what the House proposed, which is about a $20 million increase over fiscal year 2023, and that nearly $40 million increase that the Senate proposed by doubling the consensus tax revenue growth percentage.
Great, thanks, Megan.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Apologies again for losing you halfway through, but hopefully I didn't lose too many of you in the process. Like I said, always feel free to reach out to us with any further questions. We're happy to continue to be a resource as we move through the conference committee process. So thank you all very much.